This is Dr. Hamilton. Welcome to my video series on William Shakespeare's Much Ado About Nothing. In this video, I'd like to discuss Don John and the Forbidden. So, Don John is Much Ado's proud villain. He really, in my view, stands at the center of the play. He is as the villain, his job is to prevent the marriage between Claudio and Hero from taking place. And he does this by attempting in various ways to persuade Claudio that Hero has been unfaithful to him. So Don John serves as a symbol of the forbidden, as a symbol of evil, and I'll discuss that. He also has interesting and complicated motives. We'll discuss that here. And we will discuss Don John's influence on other characters, both directly and indirectly. I think that Don John is really the backbone of the play because he brings into coherence all the relationships in the play. And hopefully you will understand that by the end of this presentation. So Don John is a bastard. That's the first thing that we need to know about him. And that means that he was born from an illegitimate union. Either his mother or his father cheated on the person that they were married with, and he was the product of that. In this particular society, in Elizabethan society, this is very bad. And although he still has high status as a character, it makes him somewhat dubious. But it also sets him up as a symbol of faithlessness in love, because he is the living proof that the kind of betrayal, the kind of faithlessness that he accuses Hero of actually happens in the world. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. So apparently it's common knowledge that Don John is a bastard, but we first hear about it in Act 4, Scene 1, line 187, in the disastrous wedding scene when Claudio accuses Hero of faithlessness and cheating on him. Benedict attempts to explain why Claudio and Don Pedro believe that Hero has cheated on Claudio, and he does so by saying the practice of it lives in John the bastard. The practice meaning the plot. Whatever the cause of this horrible thing is, it was probably a plot by Don John. And he calls him John the bastard. And that, of course, signifies that he is different. He is outside of the social system, an outcast. And so Benedict raises that specter of him being a bastard at that particular moment. So this is a play that, as I said, foregrounds obsessively a skepticism about love. And so in such a play, Don John is a living symbol of the way that love can lead to betrayal, can lead to everything that Benedict fears and that Claudio becomes convinced he's become the victim of. So Don John is proof that Benedict's skepticism about love, that we've discussed elsewhere, is not entirely unfounded and cannot simply be dismissed. These are real fears. He is the dark side of love that must be overcome in order for the redemptive power of marriage and love to redeem the play. So we might even regard him as a kind of punchline. We can certainly imagine him as a punchline in one of Benedict's many indictments of love. He would be a kind of unkind punchline. The question really is, does love survive this indictment? Does love survive Don John and what he represents, which is the dark side of love, the side of love that is related to desire, animality, and treachery. Does it survive Don John's machinations, his attempt to persuade Claudio that Hero, who actually has been true to him, has actually been unfaithful to him? So what we'll see is that the play's dramatic structure wants to suggest a kind of pattern of redemption, right? And Don John really represents the danger, a danger to this pattern of redemption, the structure of redemption. And I don't think that this danger is ever really fully overcome. Don John represents a dark side of love. We have Benedict's skepticism that's comical, and I've talked to you about the imagery surrounding love. And really, the idea that love is constituted by betrayal, as symbolized by Don John, is not one that is easily overcome. We might consider, though, that the play establishes love as a kind of Silenus box, and I refer to the Silenus box in another video about Much Ado and Deception. The box is referenced in Plato's Symposium, and what it does is it symbolizes the deceptiveness of appearance. This box has an ugly exterior and it has a gold statue inside. So Don John might be the ugly, treacherous, dark side of love. Hero might be the loyal and the loyal, selfless, true side of love. And the trick, of course, that the play, and this question that the play raises, is how do you determine between the treachery and the truth? How do you peer under the surface? How do you peer behind Don John's machinations in order to discover the true heart of gold, the true loyal interior, the redemptive characteristics of love? So if we examine Don John for a moment, then not as a symbol but as a character, what we realize immediately is that Shakespeare has resisted the temptation that every other version of the story has succumbed to, other than Edmund Spenser's. And that is to afflict Don John with the same jealousy that Claudio is afflicted with. So to make Don John's primary motivation jealousy. You can see the temptation, right? It's a play about love and betrayal, and Claudio is afflicted by jealousy. So if Don John is also jealous, it shows how love leads to conflict and strife inevitably. But Shakespeare doesn't do that. Shakespeare actually makes Don John not jealous. He makes his motives more difficult and complicated and inscrutable. And this might be appropriate as a symbol of love's capacity for betrayal, as the product of love's capacity for betrayal. Don John is sort of like a black hole. He himself is incapable of love. So Don John, despite his announcement or pronouncement in Act 1, Scene 3, line 30, "It must not be denied, but that I am a plain-dealing villain," he's actually the opposite. He is embroiled in malevolent deception throughout the entire play. And in fact, far from being plain dealing, his deepest motive might actually be unknown to anyone else in the play other than himself, and so inaccessible to us. But let's try to tease out his motives nonetheless. First of all, like I said, he is a bastard, which means that he's going to be outside of really the social hierarchy. He's going to be outside of the social grid. He's never going to fully fit in. There's always going to be something suspect about his character, something that calls it into question. And so he cannot fully participate in the social repast, the social banquet that everyone else can participate in. That status of being on the outside might be part of Don John's motives. But what does Don John say? His friend says of him that he is out of measure sad. That is when he is first introduced in Act 1, Scene 3, right at the beginning. And his friend also refers to a dispute that Don John has had with his brother. He has fallen out of favor with his brother after a dispute, and we don't know what the dispute is. We know that he's sad. Is he sad about the dispute? It seems like he has other reasons to be sad. His friend Conrad actually advises Don John to act in his own rational self-interest. He says, why don't you be nice to your brother so that you yourself can prosper, so that your fortune can prosper? His brother, after all, is legitimate. His brother is a prince and quite powerful. And so Don John has the opportunity to advance if he's just nice to his brother, even if he is like a normal villain, hypocritical, pretending to be nice to him, but actually harbors a cancerous hatred of him. He can still advance his own interests. And his friend says, frame the season for your own harvest. In other words, look out for your own fortune. Just be nice to him so that you can prosper, so that you can do well, so that your own fortunes will be prosperous, will have a great harvest. But Don John refuses this kind of traditional motive of rational, even if evil, self-interest. Instead, he chooses what we might call self-will. The Elizabethans would have called this perversity, meaning that he doesn't want to do what other people want him to do, just out of sort of meanness, selfishness, self-centeredness. So he says, I would rather be a canker in a hedge than a rose in his grace. So a canker is like a worm, an insect larva that destroys shrubs. It's sort of like a termite. It does to shrubs what a termite does to a house. And so Don John is really saying, I'd rather be like this parasitic worm than a blossoming rose. And so we'll see that Don John in the play really is like a canker. He is a blight. He is a corruption. And this tendency of Don John to become a blight and corruption might be based on the truth that he's simply constitutionally unable to love, that he's in a way like a spoiled child who doesn't want to join the other children to play and instead wants to have a tantrum and gets more and more worked up because he's kind of enjoying the emotions of being worked up. It's a kind of malignant willfulness. So we might say that this, what the Elizabethans would call perversity, this malignant, willful stubbornness, is one of his motives, or at least one of his character traits. He says in Act 1, Scene 3, lines 12 to 15, I cannot hide what I am, but he does hide what he is throughout the play. I must be sad when I have cause and smile at no man's jest. eat when I have stomach and wait for no man's leisure, sleep when I am drowsy and tend on no man's business, laugh when I am merry and claw no man in his humor. The key here is no man. He doesn't want to do anything for anyone else. No man, no man, no man. No man's jest, no man's leisure, no man's business. I want to do what I want to do. And this sort of bottomless self-centeredness, for no apparent reason other than enjoying being antisocial, is a character trait that we will discuss in a little bit. Other characters in the play share to a lesser degree than Don John. So ultimately, we don't know, though, what's at the bottom of this, why he's gotten into this negative downward spiral. But Don John only says that he has a sadness that is without limit. Act 1, Scene 3, lines 3 to 5. So Don John does give an intelligible motive for his plan to destroy Claudio's happiness. He is envious of Claudio. He says in Act 1, Scene 3, lines 61 to 2, that young startup, referring to Claudio, hath all the glory of my overthrow. In other words, Claudio seems to have been promoted. That's why he has the glory of my overthrow as a consequence of Don John falling out of his brother's grace. So this seems to give an intelligible motive, but there might be another motive underneath that, and that might be the rivalry between Don John and Don Pedro, which is a kind of central structuring device. So because Claudio has come into Don Pedro's favor, if Don John destroys Claudio and destroys his happiness, that might be a way to get back at Don Pedro. And we know that Don Pedro is the intermediary that's really arranging the marriage for Claudio. So he's intimately involved. And so it's understandable that Don John could attack Don Pedro through Claudio. And this really raises a sort of strange structuring device in the play, which is that Don John and Don Pedro seem to be locked in a bitter rivalry of influence. Don Pedro influences characters for the good mostly, and Don John for evil. And as such, they become almost mythical influencers in the play. And you might imagine them almost in a different play as gods, or as God and the devil behind the scenes influencing other characters. And so this supernatural power and force almost of these two characters, their ability to influence, manipulate other characters, it really also foregrounds this idea that love has brought these characters into this realm of higher danger where they're threatened. And Don John represents, as I said, the negative side of love, the dark, threatening, disturbing aspects of love relating to betrayal, to treachery, to animality, to religious heresy, and so forth. And so Don Pedro, on the other hand, represents the aspect of love relating to grace. And that word grace is really important as it pertains to Don Pedro. Because he is a prince, he is given an honorific. He is called Your Grace, and I will talk about this more in detail when we look at some passages. But grace also means salvation, a salvation bestowed by God. And so the language relating to Don Pedro actually elevates him to a godlike status, and it really raises the stakes, and it makes us realize that in this conflict over love, in this conflict over marriage, what is at stake is really a battle between good and evil. So in this context, Don John's direct influence really becomes a kind of temptation on other characters. And one of the strange things that happens is that even when Don John does not have direct contact with other characters in any meaningful way, his traits contaminate those other characters. And that's another way that he seems to serve as a supernatural influencer. So this feature in Much Ado is a principle that also works more generally in Shakespeare's plays. Shakespeare frequently uses dramatic irony in the language of his characters. So dramatic irony is when an audience has insight into the full meaning of a character's words and actions, whereas the characters on stage are ignorant of that meaning, where they lack insight. And it's always at the character's expense, sometimes comically and sometimes tragically. But the audience has the knowledge that the characters don't have. So what Shakespeare does is he wants the audience to make connections between characters, even if those characters are not immediately causally connected to each other. So Shakespeare connects Beatrice, Benedick, Claudio on the one hand, with Don John on the other hand. And what we see is traits, negative traits that Don John has, speech patterns, infiltrate into these characters that seem to influence them. Don John is a canker. He is a worm. He is a termite that seems to destroy or won't be bent on destroying the foundation of the play, the foundation of the relationships between these characters, or he is a canker that is destroying the garden of the play. So when we're first introduced to Don John, remember that he is that repetition of no man. He doesn't want to do anything for anyone else. No man's jest, no man's leisure, no man's business. He doesn't want to make any concessions to social expectations, social good. He only wants his own way. He's set up in malignant, defiant, perverse opposition to the will and wishes of other people. However, we find that this is precisely a quality that Beatrice is criticized by when Hero criticizes her, when Beatrice overhears Hero and Ursula criticizing her. Hero says, "Of Beatrice, she cannot love, nor take no shape nor project of affection. She is so self-endeared." Oh, that's very Don John-like characteristic, isn't it? Self-endeared. So self-endeared suggests that she's in love with herself. And we remember that she is, in a way, dancing to her own tune. She just wants to do what she wants to do, out of sync with the social world. So now that we've seen that Beatrice is explicitly criticized for having traits that are similar to Don John's, we might want to go back and take a look at Beatrice's language and see if Don John's evil influence, see if his work as a worm, as a canker, has infiltrated further into her language. So let's look, for example, at Beatrice's pointed, witty, hilarious one-liner in her exchange way back in Act 1, Scene 1 with Benedick, when she says, "I'd rather hear my dog bark at a crow than a man swear he loves me." Now, let's look at Don John's line. "I would rather be a canker in a hedge than a rose in his grace." Let's hear that again. I'd rather hear my dog bark at a crow than a man swear he loves me. And now let's listen to Don John. I would rather be a canker in a hedge than a rose in his grace. Ah, there is a similarity, a parallel, a symmetry between those two lines. Don John's line is much darker, much more explicit. Beatrice's is hilarious. It's a send-up, right, of marriage and love. But they share a similar verbal construction, I had rather than. And the suggestion is that Don John's shadow seems to fall oddly on Beatrice's lines. And this is a kind of dramatic irony. See, we can hear that as an audience. Beatrice can't hear that. She can't know that because she hasn't heard what Don John has said. So we're in on something that Beatrice is not in on. She doesn't know that she's echoing Don John. And presumably she would be horrified if she did know. So this continues in Beatrice's send-up of marriage at the dance in front of her two uncles. She mocks marriage, and she compares marriage to a measure, which was a kind of stately dance. And then she describes it sort of falling apart because the husband becomes old and decrepit. And she describes the dance falling apart. Well, remember, Don John is out of measure sad. He uses measure in that instance to mean limit, so he is sad beyond a limit. And Beatrice is using measure to refer to a kind of stately dance that falls apart. But both of them use the same word. And in Shakespeare, it's not a coincidence that this stuff happens. Shakespeare, once again, we are intended to hear Beatrice using Don John's language, and we know that that is Don John's language. She doesn't know. And so it subtly undercuts, it creates a shadow on this. Now, is it hilarious? Yes. And again, we're not used to this kind of light humor having these heavier themes. But for the Elizabethans, marriage was quite a serious matter. And so although it's subject for a comedy, it's also subject for moralizing. And that's really what this is here. So the question is Beatrice's send-up of marriage, if she really means it, if she really means I'm never going to marry, for the Elizabethans, that would be a level of cynicism that might be similar to Don John's and might be related in some way to his melancholy, which might stem from a kind of antisocial, ultimately nihilism that calls into question one of the foundations of society, marriage, right? So the play is well aware of how revolutionary Beatrice's language and character is, and it's registering that in some of these ironies that we're hearing. Now, does Beatrice's proto-feminist, revolutionary, and really ultimate revolutionary comments, and I think moral clarity, does it actually become proscribed? Can it fit into these structures that the play wants to impose on them? No, I don't think that it can. I think that these verbal echoes are effective, but I think that Beatrice also defines herself as different fundamentally from Don John, and we'll see that in this small example. So later in the dance, when Beatrice encounters a masked Benedict who pretends that he doesn't recognize her, right? She hurls these volley of insults at him, and the dance has been paused, and once it begins again, Beatrice has this kind of throwaway line, or what seems like a throwaway line, we must follow the leaders. And Benedict seems to respond in an equally bland kind of throwaway line, in every good thing. But then Beatrice retorts, nay, if they lead to any ill, I will leave them at the next turning. And what she's trying to do is she's trying to turn this commonplace phrase that Benedict has said against him. But what she's actually said is that, no, I'm not going to follow the leaders if they lead to bad. If they lead to bad, I will leave them at the next turning. And it's a tiny little phrase, but it establishes her independence, her willingness to think things through on herself. And that moral independence is something that will be vindicated later when she is the one who stands up for Hero. Now, if she was just a conformist, like the play seems to suggest is a good thing, right, and only looking for the social good, right, she might not have, she certainly wouldn't defend Hero to the extent that she does, challenging Benedict to kill his best friend, right? She would just go along with it. But her moral clarity here, her independence of thought, is actually vindicated. And this obviously completely distinguishes her from Don John. So Shakespeare sets these comparisons up in language all the time. And he wants us to compare similarities, but he also wants us to see differences as well. And I should say that this dramatic irony is a function of Shakespeare's realism. So he doesn't want us to just have prescribed ways of thinking about things, purely structured ways of thinking about things. He wants to show how people are similar, how people fit certain moral prescriptions or against certain moral prescriptions, but also how they evade them and defy them. And certainly a character like Beatrice is too big for these kinds of structural devices. She evades them. And this very elegant and witty phrase, nay, if they lead to any ill, I'll leave them at the next turning, certainly does that. So her judgment is vindicated, and that then raises the question about her skepticism about other things, of whether her skepticism about marriage, about love, might be vindicated. She falls in love, but as a figure and as a thinking figure, what we remember are her criticisms of marriage and her criticisms of men and the cemented authority that men tend to have, and her ability to break up that cemented authority. And so her moral vindication, in a way, lends credence to those attacks as well. So Benedict is also a victim of Don John's infiltration. And in fact, Benedict's misogyny is the target of Don John's infiltration. So if you pay close attention, when Claudio's potential betrothal of Hero is mentioned in Act 1, Scene 3, Don John dismisses it out of hand, and he dismisses Claudio as a fool that betroths himself to unquietness. Once again, a tiny little line here, but often Shakespeare reveals himself and reveals key themes of the play in these tiny lines. He's a fool that betroths himself to unquietness. Betroth means to marry. And so what he's saying is that something very similar to what Benedict says. In other words, that marriage is simply, cynically, a series of, a person who marries just marries unquietness. They are somebody who's going to spend the rest of their life just worried about their spouse cheating on them, being unquiet. So this little line coming from Don John, in a way, goes a long way towards discrediting Benedict's misogyny and his cynicism about marriage, because Don John is such a despicable character. And this is another reason to pay close attention to Don John's lines. He doesn't have a lot of lines, but his lines are very significant because of the way that they infiltrate and serve as a commentary on other characters. So the fact that Benedict's views about marriage are echoed by this despicable character might again lead us to want to analyze Benedict's language a little bit further to see if there are other echoes of Don John in his language. Are there other ironic contrasts that are set up between Benedict's language and Don John's? So remember Don John's famous line, "I'd rather be a canker in a hedge than a rose in his grace." Well, this language is also echoed by Benedict. In his soliloquy, in Act 2, Scene 3, lines 23 to 5, he says, "Till all graces be in one woman shall not come into my grace. Till all graces, all charms be in one woman shall not come into my grace, one woman shall not come into my favor." In other words, I would rather be alone than to be with a woman that is not perfect. Okay, I would rather be alone till one woman has all graces, one woman shall not come into my grace. So until a woman's perfect, I am going to have nothing to do with her. She shall not come into my grace and in my favor. So he would rather be alone than to be with a woman who is imperfect, right? This is a very, very similar idea to Don John's line, "I'd rather be a canker in a hedge than a rose in his grace." And we remember, of course, that the word grace here means graces as in charms and graces as in favor, but it also has that meaning which is salvation, a salvation provided by God. And so we might say here that Benedict is really denying himself a kind of redemption or salvation that love can provide. And this is really borne out by the play, because in that powerful scene between Beatrice and Benedict does experience a kind of moral clarity, and he is able to take decisive action. He becomes a better person because of his love for Beatrice. And he has a genuine moment of revelation when he says, "Is it not strange that he is in love?" He's shocked that he is in love, that it's happened to him. And he's shocked and taken aback by the grace, by the redemption that he has experienced in love. And so if he had remained in that state, he never would have had the chance to experience that. And so this is a reminder that, once again, Don John is the enemy of grace. He is the blocking agent. He's trying to break up marriages and block people from being fully realized because of his perversity, because of his rivalry with his brother, or because of some other inscrutable reason that we don't really know or understand. But he seems to be in the business of denying people a kind of salvation, a kind of redemption that is possible for them. And so we can hear this in Claudio's language too. Of course, Claudio is the one that Don John acts on directly. Beatrice and Benedict don't spend much time with Don John at all. But as I said, we, through the dramatic irony, through Shakespeare's dramatic irony, can overhear that they are echoing Don John nonetheless. And they might be horrified if they knew that they were echoing Don John's language, but we know it, right? And so that is a signal to us that those tendencies are leading them towards the darker aspects of love, towards the aspects of love that lead to mistrust, that lead to social disunion, that lead to treachery. So when Claudio is in the middle of experiencing Don John's, being possessed really by Don John's slander, and he denounces Hero at her wedding in front of her friends and in front of her family. He cries in words that will unconsciously echo Don John. For thee I'll lock up all the gates of love, and on my eyelids shall conjecture hang, to turn all beauty into thoughts of harm, and never shall it more be gracious. Key here is that he's going to turn all beauty into thoughts of harm. And that might be a way to sum up what Don John actually does. He turns beauty, truth, sunlight into thoughts of harm. He is an infection that converts beauty into ruin, really. And notice this word gracious once again. Never shall it more be gracious. He's saying once again, I will never love again, right? And I would rather be alone than to be graced by love. I'd rather be a canker in a hedge than a rose in his grace. Don John is an expert at making clones of himself, and now he has turned Claudio into his clone, into his creature. And I would just say in closing here that the dark side of love that Don John exemplifies, both as a symbol, he is a symbol of treachery. As a bastard, he's a symbol of what he accuses Hero of, a living symbol that love can lead to infidelity, that love can lead to betrayal, that love might even be constituted by betrayal. And he is a living symbol of that, as a figure who symbolizes this dark side of love. He is not he's not an obstacle that is easy to get over. And although Shakespeare does have a redemptive framework, and I think that especially through the characters of Beatrice and Benedict, we see that it can work, but it doesn't work in every case. The plot really brings Claudio to a kind of redemption and brings his marriage into a kind of uneasy alliance, but we might attribute that just as well to Hero trying to save her reputation. I mean, the generous reading would be to say that Hero's selflessness is what saves the marriage, but in reality, she might just want to get Claudio up there in front of everybody so that she can get him to restore her reputation in public after she has been denounced, right, by him. So, that doesn't really serve as a sign of love's power to redeem as much as the place wants to try to make of it in a certain way. And so this idea that love, desire can lead to betrayal, and that it has this dark side, the side of animality, the side of betrayal that the play works through in all of these other images, that it leads people to become something that they're not, and as a consequence that it's destructive of social institutions as opposed to upholding them. That is something that's not easy to dismiss. And furthermore, the cemented male authority within the institution of marriage that Beatrice attacks and is not really undercut. I mean, I'm sorry, the cemented authority that Beatrice attacks, and that cemented power, Beatrice's attacks are not really undercut. And in fact, Beatrice's moral character is really vindicated by what she does in the play. And so I think that this play wants to rein Don John in, and it does so in a certain way by making his attacks not incredibly effectual. Dogberry and Verges are able to uncover the plot. But at the same time, I think the darker aspects of love that Don John raises are not easily dismissed. And in a play like Othello, those darker aspects will have a tragic consequences, and the full power of those darker aspects of love will be on full display. So thank you everybody for being with me, and I look forward to seeing you in the next lesson.